Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast. To our listeners and viewers around the world, a growing community, which we're really happy about. Thank you for joining us. Here we dive into meaningful dialogue on Palestine, offering insight and context that we find is often missing from mainstream legacy media, while also celebrating Palestine's very rich culture and history. Today, we're very excited to have a special guest with us, Mouin Rabbani, to discuss Palestine, Zionism, the pursuit of justice, and all of those wonderful things. Mouin, welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And Ahlan and welcome, Mouin.
Hi. Hi to you as well. Thank you.
Great. Just before we start, I wanted to acknowledge we'd like to do a little recap of current events. And there is currently catastrophic, intentional, and inhuman starvation of Palestinians going on in Gaza. I speak on Sunday, 25th of May. This is illegal, for Israel has blocked all aid to Gaza for nearly 3 months, using starvation as a weapon of war, resulting in the death by starvation that we know about of at least 200 Palestinians, mainly children, who die first. And thousands more are at risk daily. If you are not aware of this, perhaps consider switching to Democracy Now!, other source-based media instead of legacy media. This is a deliberate campaign of collective punishment of the most brutal kind, having parents watch their children starved to death, and it's a continuation of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. On that happy note, let me give you a brief bio of our wonderful guests. Mouin Rabbani is a Palestinian Dutch analyst and writer, regarded as one of the most incisive voices on Palestinian politics, international law, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He has previously served as a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group and has worked with the United Nations. Mouin has written extensively on Zionism, settler colonialism, and the failures of the so-called peace process, and he is a fierce critic of the Oslo Accords, which we will get into shortly. His work is regularly featured in publications like the London Review of Books, The Nation, and Middle East Report. Mouin, I wanted to ask you as our first question, because I come to this podcast as a novelist and a filmmaker, and so of course my entire storytelling life is about defining personal moments and turning points. So throughout your career, you've examined critically the impact of imperialism and power dynamics in the Palestinian struggle. Were there specific events or encounters in your life that significantly deepened this commitment that you have to advocating for Palestine, or was it a gradual thing? What's the story there?
Well, I guess the simple answer to your question is that I'm Palestinian, so I've had a lifelong personal interest in the matter, you might say. But I think also growing up in Europe and then living in the United States really exposed me to the profound ignorance that public opinion had back then. Whenever people would ask, "Where are you from?" and you would respond, "I'm Palestinian," they would say, "Well, there's no such thing." I mean, they would be looking at me, looking me in the face and telling me I don't exist. And this was really not done out of any maliciousness, or at least most of the time. It wasn't done with malicious intent, but really out of pure ignorance. And I guess since you mentioned imperialism, I think the defining moment, of course, was 1917. When Great Britain issued the Balfour Declaration. And without that, Zionism would have just ended up as yet one more utopia, dystopia, whatever you want to call it, in the dustbin of history, because the Zionist movement's leadership recognized from the very outset that their project was entirely dependent on great power sponsorship. And without such sponsorship, it would have never gotten off the ground. Now, it just so happened that Britain, during the final years of the First World War, for reasons we can get into if you're interested, decided that establishing what British leaders at the time called the Jewish Ulster in the Middle East, basically a protectorate surrounded by a hostile environment, best suited their imperial and global interests. I think another turning point would be the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which showed, I think, just how close U.S.-Israeli relations had become, and clarified to me at least that this whole concept that somehow the United States is at the mercy of Israel and the Zionist lobby and so on is really an illusion, and that Israel is first and foremost a regional proxy of American global power. This was, I think, particularly true during the Cold War years. And I think the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon demonstrates that perhaps to a better extent than any similar event I can think of.
Mm-hmm. And an illusion it is, as you say, Mouin, because Zionism is really framed in the West as quote unquote a liberation movement. But you've accurately argued in your work, it's a settler colonial project, as you just mentioned, and it's very much rooted in displacement and replacement of the indigenous Palestinian people. And I think in your work, you pointed out the strategic use of violence, land theft, legal erasure as tools of the settler colonial project. Could you just talk us through how Zionism operates as a settler colonial ideology and its effects on history and what's happening? Too many questions in one, sorry, but it's just to kind of have a better framing of
Well, maybe a better way to answer your question is to look at how and where and why the Zionist movement emerged. The contemporary Zionist movement, that political movement that led ultimately in 1948 to the establishment of the State of Israel, originated in Europe. The impetus for the establishment of the Zionist movement did not come from the Jews of Iraq or the Jews of Yemen or the Jews of Morocco. It came from the Jews of Europe, or at least a section of the Jews of Europe. And Zionism emerged in a context where the Jews of Europe were grappling with the twin challenges of, on the one hand, emancipation, made possible in the aftermath of the French Revolution, and on the other, of increased discrimination and persecution. And this led to a variety of responses to what was then known as a Jewish question. You had, for example, Orthodox religious Jews who saw the main threat of as being Jewish assimilation into European society, and sought to kind of preserve their separate and distinct communities in order to preserve, let's say, the religious communities. Then you had, for example, many Jews gravitating towards socialist or communist movements, which for them held the prospect of the liberation of entire societies from the yoke of capitalism, and that Jews would be liberated along with everyone else. And then you also had many Jews gravitating towards liberalism and assimilation, which is basically looking at Jews not so much as a community, but as individuals who would achieve equal rights of citizenship, and so on, as their compatriots were at the time. This was, of course, during the late 19th century. And then you had a new stream which took the position that the Jews are not a religious minority, or, let's say, individual citizens of their country, but rather they are a nation and a people in their own right, just as the English, the Danes, or the French. And in the context of late 19th century Europe, well, if you're a nation and a people, then of course you must have a state. And the state is kind of the highest expression of nationalism and peoplehood. So the Zionist response to these twin pressures of assimilation and persecution was that the Jewish condition would only be normalized when this group of people, who Zionism defined as a nation and a people, acquired a state of their own. And just like every other state in Europe at the time, it would be one in which this particular nation, in this case, the Jews, would exercise political, territorial, and demographic supremacy. And ultimately, at the first Zionist Congress held in the closing years of the 19th century in the Swiss city of Basel, the Zionist program chose Palestine as the what do you call it, the territory in which this Jewish state would be established. They considered many others, from Madagascar to Libya to California, but ultimately chose Palestine, both because of its clear historical connection to Jewish religion and Jewish history, but also because this was also seen as the best way of attracting Jewish support. It was felt, that if you establish a Jewish state in Madagascar or Libya, you're not going to get very much Jewish support. And here, the first opponents of Zionism, they were not Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims, for that matter. The first opponents of Zionism were, in fact, European Jews who saw this as a threat to their own position in Europe, and the religious Jews who also fervently believed in a return to Zion held the position that this could only come through divine intervention, and that uh, any attempt to promote a return, as they called it, of Jews to Zion through human agency was blasphemy. And then these other streams that I discussed viewed it as a threat to the position of Jews in Europe. And it's quite telling that when the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, the only member of the British cabinet that voted against the government's adoption of the Balfour Declaration was the only Jewish member of the British cabinet, who again, in addition to his distaste for Zionism and the methods of the Zionist leaders, felt that it threatened the position of Jews in Europe. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it's important to bear this background. Now, regarding Zionism being a colonial movement, of course, when you say so in the 21st century, Israel and its flunkies are up in arms. How dare you? This has always been our territory, and all the rest of this bunk. But look at what the Zionists themselves were saying. They described their own movement as a colonial movement because, in the 19th and early 20th century, there was nothing pejorative about it in a European context. Of course, if you were if you were Syrian or Indian or whatever, Vietnamese, then of course it had a very pejorative meaning. But in Europe, there was no damage attached to describing yourself as a colonial movement, and the Zionist movement established institutions that had colonial in their name.
Yeah.
The leading founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, his icon, his role model was none other than Cecil Rhodes, who established, on behalf of Britain, the territory in southern Africa that ended up bearing his name, Rhodesia, until it was liberated and became contemporary Zimbabwe. So there's never really been any debate about whether or not Zionism was a colonial or a settler colonial movement. That was promoted first and foremost by the Zionist movement's leaders themselves. It's only in recent decades when colonialism and so on acquired a much more negative connotation in the West, that all of a sudden, every time you point out this reality, Israel and its flunkies are up in arms. How dare you? And I think one other element to discuss here is, the Zionist idea was not just to establish a state in Palestine, it was to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, going way beyond, any connection, the undoubted connection that the Jews had with the Holy Land dating back centuries and millennia. The program was to transform what had been an overwhelmingly Arab territory into not just a Jewish state, but an exclusivist Jewish state. In other words, the Zionist program from the very outset never put forward a vision of coexistence with the existing population in Palestine. It was from the very outset a project of hegemony, displacement, and replacement. I mean, all these lunatics now in the West talking about, the great replacement theory and so on. Well, that actually happened in Palestine in 1948.
Yeah. But going back to the Balfour, because we mentioned, okay, the 1917 Balfour Declaration sort of pledged, as you said, they needed bigger support. So here was the British support for a national home for the Jewish people. Interesting that the only Jewish MP was the one who voted against it.
Was an MP. He was a cabinet minister.
Cabinet minister. Sorry. Yes. So that's there. But then in 1922, the League of Nations, I thought, mandated Britain to protect Palestinian rights and guide them to independence, because there was sort of this double playing of some kind. And I don't understand that to be creating an exclusively Jewish state that marginalized Palestinians and affected their sovereignty or their ability to govern themselves. So was the Balfour Declaration illegal? Was the decision of the League of Nations to adopt it illegal? Or were the problems afterwards with the Zionist agenda of trying to create a state when they were?
Well, I'm trying to remember the person who at the time characterized the Balfour Declaration as one nation promising the territory of a second to a third.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at it in moral and political terms, it was manifestly illegal and immoral and never should have happened. The origins of the Balfour Declaration, there have been all kinds of theories, from Britain trying to curry favor with American Jews who it viewed as very powerful, and was hoping that through issuing this declaration, American Jews would exercise their influence in Washington to ensure that the United States remained committed to the Allied side during the First World War. Another theory is that in the context of the Russian Revolution, this was a way to give European Jews an alternative to socialism and communism and keep them on side. I think the most persuasive explanation of the Balfour Declaration is we have to remember that at the time, the crown jewel in the British Empire was, of course, India. And the Suez Canal was a jugular vein of the British Empire. It was an absolutely vital transportation route between Great Britain and India. And in 1915, during the First World War, the Ottomans tried to march across the Sinai Peninsula to seize the Suez Canal. And this put the fear of God into London. And it is in that context that they were committed to ensuring the permanent security of the eastern flank of the Suez Canal. The Sinai Peninsula itself is relatively unpopulated. But if you control Palestine, particularly by implanting in it what the British called not a Jewish state, but a Jewish national home, meaning that from the British perspective, the ambition was to create a protectorate rather than an independent state, as I mentioned previously, a Jewish Ulster. Well, this would be a very effective solution to that challenge experienced by Britain. Now, during the First World War, Britain made a number of contradictory commitments. In what is known as the Hussein McMahon correspondence between, I believe he was at the time the chief British official in Egypt, and Sharif Hussein, the great-grandfather of, or great-great-grandfather, forgive me if I'm wrong, of Jordan's current monarch, Abdullah II, who at the time ruled over the Hejaz, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, on behalf of the Ottomans. Britain pledged to support the establishment of a united Arab kingdom encompassing all of the former Ottoman territories, with the exception of more or less what is contemporary Lebanon, if Sharif Hussein would lead in what was known as the Arab Revolt against Ottoman rule. Secondly, Britain was secretly negotiating with France and Tsarist Russia to divide up the territories of the Ottoman Empire between themselves after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. And given that we're talking about a Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox states, they couldn't figure out how to resolve the issue of Palestine. And I think it was at Russian insistence, decided that Palestine would come under international administration rather than be ruled by anyone of the three states. But what happened, of course, is in 1917, you had the Bolshevik Revolution. Russia's new leaders publicized the secret diplomatic correspondence between Britain, France, and Russia, and withdrew from these arrangements. And then Britain and France continued to negotiate among themselves and produced what is known as a Sykes-Picot Agreement. And in that context, France ultimately succumbed to British pressure and blandishments and agreed that Palestine, rather than remaining as an international, under international administration, would come under British rule. And at the same time, of course, you had the negotiations between the British government and the World Zionist Organization that resulted in the Balfour Declaration that we've just been discussing. Now, after the end of the First World War, the League of Nations was established, and in order to seize the territories of the Ottoman Empire, of the former Ottoman Empire, and German colonies in Africa, they developed this charade that was known as the mandate system, which were then classed as A, B, and C mandates. Palestine and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq were classified as Class A mandates, meaning that their independence was provisionally recognized, but they needed the tutelage of these awesome white Europeans in order to help prepare them for independence. Well, in the case of Palestine, preparing for independence meant the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, because it wasn't the Hussein McMahon correspondence that was incorporated into the mandate, but rather the Balfour Declaration was incorporated into the terms of the mandate. So it was a total charade. Now, you would have to ask a specialist in international law about the legality of this particular arrangement. Let's not forget, slavery was for many centuries considered perfectly legal, along with many other notorious practices. But quite clearly, it was an affront to the principle of decolonization, or at the time, something that had already been introduced into our vocabulary, the principle of self-determination. And it's telling at the time that the US President, Wilson, dispatched a commission to the region composed of two prominent Americans known as a King Crane Commission. And their brief was to gauge the ambitions and aspirations of the peoples of the former Ottoman Empire. In other words, not just Palestinians, but also those in the general area of Greater Syria. And what was interesting at the time is they came away with two conclusions. The first was that the greatest aspiration of all these people was to form a united Arab state encompassing all the former Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire. And the second most important position that was expressed to them was an absolute rejection of Zionism, because Palestinians, Arabs, understood from very early on that you can't establish a Jewish state in an Arab territory without getting rid of the Arabs, which is, of course, what happened in 1948. And it's a very interesting report because they also spoke extensively with British officers who all made very clear that from their point of view, the Zionist program could only be imposed in Palestine at the point of a rifle. And that is, of course, exactly what happened. One last point is that the British general who conquered Jerusalem in November of 1917, Edmund Allenby, arrived in Jerusalem just about the same time that the British government adopted the Balfour Declaration. And one of his first decrees was to ban the publication of the Balfour Declaration in Palestine, because he knew exactly what impact it would have on the local population.
They lied and made deals, as you say, with different people and honored only their own. But Mouin, we talked briefly before we started, lots of people don't know about Christian Palestinians and Christian Arabs. So my family is Christian Palestinian, my dad from Bethlehem, my mom from Jerusalem, a Nakba survivor. And her villa in West Jerusalem, her parents' villa, was stolen and given to German Jews. It's the same with their building in Haifa, where she was born. And really, the Zionist narrative still claims that the Palestinians, quote unquote, left voluntarily, and that or they were encouraged by other Arab neighboring countries, which we know are it's lies and fabrications. But could you talk about how this Zionist propaganda can be dismantled once and for all, because they keep justifying something that's fake?
It's interesting that you should mention Christian Palestinians, which is interesting for a number of reasons. If we go back to the late 19th century, at the time that the Zionist movement was established and began its program of transforming Palestine into a Jewish state, Palestinian Christians constituted roughly 10% of the population. But interestingly, they were also the fastest growing segment of the population. And this had to do, I think, with their primarily urban character, where they had better access to improvements in hygiene and healthcare and so on. They also, given that this is the Holy Land and that foreign churches, whether the Russian Orthodox Church or the Vatican or whatever, took a real interest in these communities. They also had access to more educational opportunities and so on, and were very much, and remain for that matter, an integral component of Palestinian society. Certainly, if we look at the contemporary Palestinian nationalist movement, which developed during the 1950s and 1960s, it has many prominent Christian leaders, most notably George Habash, who in 1952 established the movement of Arab nationalists, and then in 1967 established the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And then Naif Hawatmi, who was actually Transjordanian, or Jordanian rather than Palestinian, but also Christian, although, these were both Marxists, so I'm not sure whether Christian is the right term to use with them. But established and led the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the mainstream, the spinal cord of the Palestinian national movement, Fatah, always had very significant Christian representation. And it's interesting because over the years, and particularly in recent decades, the mainstay of support for Israel in the West has increasingly shifted from Jewish communities in Western countries to evangelical Christians. On at one level, they try to pretend Palestinian Christians don't exist and try to pretend, these are Muslim societies populated exclusively by radical jihadis and so on. You will have seen a lot of that in the propaganda during the Gaza genocide. But also, for them, ultimately, the destruction of Christian communities in Palestine is collateral damage. To them, it's a price worth paying for their apocalyptic millenarian visions of of Armageddon. So what I've learned is that educating these people about Palestinian Christian communities, about the existential threat that Zionism has formed to Christianity in Palestine and Palestinian Christian communities, leaves them absolutely cold. They couldn't care less. If they see an Israeli soldier pointing a gun at the temple of a Palestinian Christian child, their only response will be pull the damn trigger because it brings Armageddon closer. It's really
Okay.
it's really incredible. But getting back to your question, of course, this all came to a head. The transformation of Palestine, as Ibrahim, the late Ibrahim Abu Lughod, put it so cogently in one of in the title of one of his books, um, came to a head during the late 1940s. Um, During the second half of the 1930s, Palestinians launched a prolonged rebellion, primarily against British rule, because, of course, they understood that without what the preeminent Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi has called the British Shield, Zionism didn't stand a chance. And it was a prolonged uprising that began with what at that point was the longest general strike in recorded history from April to October 1936, and then developed into an armed insurrection during which Palestinian guerrillas controlled even the capital of mandatory Palestine, Jerusalem, by night, but was put down with extraordinary ferocity by the British, including blowing up entire quarters of cities, bombing with the Air Force, summary executions, and all the rest of it. So by the time World War II started, Palestinian leadership had been entirely decimated through these eliminations and deportations and so on. And so even before the Palestine War, as it's called in the late 1940s, began, um, Palestinians were already at a disadvantage. And I think the outcome of that war for Palestinians, can only be understood in the context of the decimation of their leadership during the late 1930s. The second development, of course, was that Britain emerged from World War II effectively bankrupt, no longer able to sustain this global empire. Even the crown jewel of its empire, India, which achieved independence as India and Pakistan that same year in 1948, or perhaps it was 1949. And Britain was also now facing a armed insurgency from the Zionist movement in Britain, particularly from some of its more radical militias, one of whom during World War II even went so far as to propose a formal alliance with Nazi Germany in order to evict the British from Palestine. And these movements, in fact, introduced and pioneered many of the tactics, such as car bombs and so on, that Israel would later consistently characterize as terrorism when they were used by others. So Britain was no longer able to sustain its empire. It was facing constant attacks from the Zionist movement. And in 1946, informed the newly formed United Nations that it was basically planning to end its mandate and threw the issue into the UN's lap. The United Nations in November, on the 29th of November of 1947, was given two options: one, a federal state, and one, partition with two states, with the exception of Jerusalem, that would continue as a region under international administration, given its enormous global and religious significance. The Palestinians, needless to say, categorically rejected partition when it was adopted by a majority of the UN General Assembly at the time, because not only did they reject the principle of establishing a foreign state in their land, most of whom's inhabitants had been either born abroad or were born to parents who were born abroad, but the UN's partition plan also gave more than 50% of the territory of Palestine to one-third of the population. The Jewish population of the proposed Jewish state barely formed a majority even in that territory. And Jewish ownership of Palestinian land at the time was something on the order of 6 or 7%. Yet, it basically gave them the keys to the kingdom, and the Palestinians categorically rejected this for the multiple reasons I just outlined. The Zionist movement, or at least the formal Zionist leadership, accepted the resolution, and it accepted it on the grounds that it provided international legitimacy to the principle of a Jewish state in Palestine. It didn't accept the borders. It did accept the resolution, to be sure, but the available records make very clear that for them, they were accepting international legitimacy while maintaining the freedom to alter the proposed state's borders, which of course is exactly what happened. Civil war almost immediately broke out, and on the 14th of May, the final British soldier left. Israel proclaimed its independence, and the five surrounding Arab states proceeded to intervene by sending their armies into Palestine. Now, in the Zionist version of events, the Israeli version of events, what happened is very clear. The Arabs started a war, they lost, and they should stop whining about the results. There was no plan to expel the Palestinians. Israel survived against overwhelming odds. It was a divine miracle, and all the rest of it. Well, let's take these one by one. The idea that somehow the conflict was initiated by the Palestinians, that would be true if you had evidence that it was the Palestinians who started migrating to Poland and to Russia, and to other areas of Eastern Europe to establish an Arab state, a Muslim state, whatever you want to call it, in these territories. It was, of course, the exact opposite. It was Jews coming from Europe under British arms to establish a national home and ultimately a state, not only in Palestine, but at the expense of the Palestinians. Secondly, as once again the preeminent Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi began demonstrating already during the late 1950s, and many others, including leading Israeli historians, have demonstrated since then. Transfer, as it's called in Zionist parlance, the expulsion of the Arab population was embedded in the ideological core of Zionism, because Zionists understood from the beginning that without territorial, political, and demographic hegemony and supremacy, you can't have a Jewish state in Palestine. It would be, it would be an Arab territory. And, the evidence is overwhelming. More importantly, by the time that Israel was established in May of 1948, well over 300,000 Palestinians had already been uprooted and dispossessed from their homes, from their towns, from their villages. So it is not as if, this was a response to Arab armies intervening in Palestine. It had been going on for almost half a year by the time Israel was established. And perhaps most importantly, ethnic cleansing, as you put it, consists of two elements: forcing people out, expelling them, forcing them to flee, however you want to put it, and just as importantly, preventing their return. And the evidence that Israel undertook systematic efforts to prohibit and prevent their return through legislation, through military force, through all kinds of other measures, is black on white. No one denies it. Even the Israelis don't deny that they forbade these people from returning to their homes. And more importantly, Israel began to systematically raze their villages. Hundreds of most villages were razed to the ground. Arab quarters and cities were looted bare. So, and then, the final point you mentioned, Arab armies. Well, this is based on purported radio broadcasts. And already in the late 1950s or early 1960s, an Irish specialist, Erskine Childers, went through the BBC records, because the BBC had a monitoring station in Cyprus, which monitored all radio broadcasts from the region at the time, to look for these supposed radio broadcasts in which Arab armies or Arab political leaders were urging Palestinians to flee so that they could invade and nip the Jewish state in the bud. Well, the evidence quite simply didn't exist. And also, if you think about it logically, if this was indeed the intention of the Arab political leaders, why would they urge hundreds of thousands of people to clog the roads that they would have wanted to keep open for their tanks and armored personnel carriers and infantry to go fight the Zionist militias and later the Israeli army? It simply defies logic, and lo and behold, it never really happened.
Yeah, exactly. Another propaganda. And yet, I mean, there's so many propagandas to uncover, but another one is that Palestinians are always walking away from peace agreements, so-called peace agreements. And you've been a very vocal critic on the Oslo Accords, and I think rightly so. Do you mind just telling us or telling the audience, elaborating on why Oslo was not really a peace agreement? It was only there to normalize, if you like, the Zionists. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's just in terms of your broader question. This, of course, goes back to former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban's famous dictum that the Palestinians never lose an opportunity to lose an opportunity. In other words, Israel, from its inception, has been, throwing tons of olive branches at the Palestinians, and the Palestinians have just been using them as firewood. The history is quite the opposite, and I would urge people who want to know more about the period before 1948 on this issue to look at the outstanding book published by Laurie Allen about 2 or 3 years ago called A History of False Hope. And it gets into many of these things. And as for efforts to reach a peaceful resolution of, let's call it, the conflict for now, after 1948. Well, just to give one example, here again, researcher Coulter Lauwerse has written an outstanding monograph on how the PLO in 1976 sponsored a draft resolution at the United Nations Security Council endorsing a two-state settlement that was sabotaged by the Americans and the British, of course, in close collaboration with the Israelis. And then, of course, the three of them turned around and accused the Palestinians of rejecting peace. But to get to your question, the Oslo agreements were signed in September of 1993 between Israel and the PLO. The Oslo Accords are all of 3 or 4 pages long, at least the original 1993 text. It's for the most part written in plain English with very little technical jargon. And I would urge everyone to read it and to read the accompanying letters of recognition exchanged between the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, and the chairman of the executive committee of the PLO, Yasser Arafat. So Oslo is often presented as a blueprint for a two-state settlement. But then you actually read the accords. It doesn't mention Palestinian state. It doesn't mention Palestinian self-determination. It doesn't even mention the word occupation. So it doesn't mention anything about a two-state settlement. The only thing it says about the final outcome of this process, which was supposed to happen in no later than, I believe, 1999, is that permanent status issues, as are described by Oslo, which are issues such as borders, settlements, refugees, water, and so on, effectively the issues that collectively define the question of Palestine in the context of the two-state paradigm are shunted forward. They're not addressed in 1993. They're supposed to be resolved by 1999 in what is called a permanent status agreement. And the only frame of reference for this agreement is United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 and 338. Now, the issue here is not that these two resolutions don't even mention the Palestinians, let alone a Palestinian people or a Palestinian self-determination or a Palestinian state. The issue is that the two parties to the Oslo agreements, the Israelis and the Palestinians, have diametrically opposed and fundamentally incompatible interpretations of these resolutions. The Palestinians, and indeed the international community as a whole, has understood those resolutions as requiring Israel to withdraw from all territories occupied in 1967 in exchange for normalized relations with its adversaries. Israel, on the other hand, with some form of American support, I should add, has claimed that the absence of the definite article V before occupied territories in 242 means that Israel is not obliged to withdraw from all occupied territories, even though the preamble to this resolution insists on the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. And Israel was in fact arguing that in 1982, when it withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula, the Egyptian territory that it had occupied in 1967, it relinquished more than 90% of the territory it occupied in 1967, and therefore, even prior to Oslo, had already fulfilled its obligations under the Security Council resolutions. So you have fundamentally incompatible interpretations of the terms of reference of what's supposed to be a permanent diplomatic agreement. Well, then you look for arbitration mechanisms. Here, the arbitration mechanism doesn't exist in the sense that the Palestinians cannot simply invoke arbitration because they need Israeli consent for any arbitration mechanism to be activated. So Israel maintained a veto over whether any of these disputes could be put forward to arbitration or not. And I could go on, but the long and short of it is that Israel in the early 1990s was facing a number of challenges and a number of opportunities, and which I won't get into here, but it addressed these by seeking to fundamentally reconfigure the occupation in order to maintain its control over the Palestinian people and the occupied territories, rather than reaching an agreement that would end the occupation. And in fact, since 1993, Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank and until 2005 in the Gaza Strip was expanding exponentially. And now, this past July, we have a ruling from the International Court of Justice that the occupation is illegal, full stop. Oslo or no Oslo, whatever is rights Israel may invoke under Oslo, have now become thoroughly irrelevant. Israel has no right of rule in either the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, or the Gaza Strip, and is required not only to leave, but to dismantle all of its illegal settlements.
Yeah. Mouin, I just wanted to say that we're talking about the effects of Zionism, ramifications constantly, but we're seeing now, finally, in the wake of an ongoing genocide, an increase in Jewish voices who are rejecting Zionism, insisting that it's not Judaism, which of course it isn't, but it's still conflated that way. And there's this growing discourse distinguishing Zionism, political movement, from Judaism, religion. You've discussed the ideological underpinnings of Zionism and its implications here. Why is it important to make this distinction, and how can we help to, push that narrative back out into the world in the face of this propaganda that is conflated?
Well, the distinction is absolutely vital, because if Zionism and Judaism are identical, then anti-Zionism would mean that you harbor an opposition to a irrational hatred of Jews solely for the sole reason of their identity. And you're not opposed to a political project. You're not opposed to a state on the basis of its criminal actions and an apartheid regime and now genocide and so on. So the distinction is absolutely vital. And as I was saying earlier in our discussion, it bears recollection that the first opponents of Zionism in Europe in the late 19th century, they were not Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims or Eastern Christians. They were European Jews, because they experienced Zionism as a threat, or in some cases as blasphemy. Now that obviously changed, and in the wake of the Holocaust, which basically exterminated many of these communities that were either non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, there was much less discussion about the rights and wrongs of Zionism within Jewish circles. And after 1967 and Israel's overwhelming military victory, Jews worldwide began to identify with Israel to a much greater extent than they had previously. But in recent decades, we've seen that begin to change, particularly among younger generations. You began to see a little of it in 1982 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the Sabra Shatila massacres that September. Began to see a little more during the First Intifada, even more during the Second Intifada. And now it seems a dam is broken with the genocide in the Gaza Strip. And the irony here is that as the Israeli peace movement has all but vanished during this period, polarization about Israel within Jewish communities, particularly in the West, has really risen and grown. I mean, you look at these campus protests during the past year and a half. I can't think of a single one that didn't have Jewish activists in its leadership. And I think it's fair to say that a growing number of Jews in these societies, whether they're a majority or not, I don't know. I suspect not, but getting there, are either indifferent to Israel or hostile to Israel. And so the defense mechanism by Israel and its flunkies, what I call the Haspera Symphony Orchestra, is to start, denouncing these people. They're self-hating Jews. They're anti-Semites, because anti-Semite used to mean someone who hated Jews because they're Jewish. It's hatred of an identity, of an individual or group of people because of their identity and no other reason. The current definition of anti-Semitism is that anyone who opposes anything Israel does is an anti-Semite, irrespective of their identity. So you can be a Muslim, you can be a Christian, you can be Jewish, you can be a Jewish rabbi and denounce Israel and be an anti-Semite. Because at the end of the day, Israel and its flunkies have become so drunk with power, have enjoyed impunity for so long, that they're determined to delegitimize any and all opposition to any of their policies, any of their actions. Go ask one of these Israel apologists when they try to make the case that they're not against criticism of Israel, just illegitimate criticisms of Israel. Ask them to identify what they would consider legitimate criticism of Israel. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Criticism by Israel of Israel is, in their view, illegitimate because it's criticism of Israel, full stop. And any criticism of Israel is by definition anti-Semitic, even if being uttered by a Jewish rabbi.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this continuous clamping down of freedoms, we're seeing it as sort of exposing the Western hypocrisy at most. Zionism is a brutal settler colonial, ethno-supremacist, and ruthless apartheid regime. Shamim's family is South African Indian. They've experienced apartheid, and this is much worse than Israeli apartheid, than any other apartheid. But solution-wise, because different people have different views, from my perspective, I believe in one democratic decolonized state from the river to the sea, with full equality, with reparation and full rights, and the right of return, of course, of all Palestinians. And I don't know what your vision is for a lasting, viable future. How do you see it working? Or do you see it working?
Well, now that you've mentioned South Africa, of course, there are significant distinctions between apartheid as it was practiced in South Africa and apartheid as practiced by Israel in Palestine. But I would like to just point to one fundamental difference, which is that in South Africa, the white minority sought to exploit the labor of the African majority. It was quite happy to live in a society where whites constituted only some 10% of 10% of the population of the country, even though, of course, a lot of them, were deprived of the right of citizenship and so on. But their primary relationship towards the majority population was one of exploitation. And their primary objective was economic supremacy and maintaining economic hegemony in South Africa. In Israel, we're dealing with a fundamentally different kettle of fish. Israel had the opportunity to establish that kind of a regime and to exploit Palestinian labor. But the primary motivation was not to exploit, but to dispossess and to remove. In other words, it has more in common with the process of Indian removal in North America during the colonial period than it does with the exploitation we've seen in South Africa. Of course, Israel does exploit Palestinian labor, but ideally, for Israel, there would be no Palestinian labor to exploit because there wouldn't be any Palestinians living in the Jewish state, and I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind because in South Africa, the white minority was ultimately prepared to relinquish political hegemony in order to maintain its economic supremacy. Whereas in Israel, I think it's quite the opposite, that the primary priority of most Israeli Jews, and certainly of the Zionist leadership, is to maintain political hegemony, even if it comes at the expense of economic supremacy. And therefore, I think these issues are important to keep in mind. Now, as you know, and as you mentioned yourself, there are multiple formulas proposed over the years of how to resolve what is known as a question of Palestine. And the international consensus, at least until now, has been a two-state settlement, which is not going back to the partition map of 1948, but rather the armistice lines of 1949, where you have a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, independent, sovereign, removal of Israel and its settlements to the 1967 boundaries, including East Jerusalem, and what is known as a just resolution of the refugee question. I have argued and written in favor of the two-state paradigm for a number of years for reasons I'm happy to discuss, but won't just now. But what I think the past 2 years have demonstrated, beyond any doubt whatsoever, and I could be faulted for not having recognized this earlier, is that the reason you can't have a two-state settlement has nothing to do with points of no return or the extent of Israeli colonization of the West Bank and so on, but that Israel, with its insatiable lust for Palestinian land, with its incapability of reaching any kind of negotiated resolution with any of its adversaries. It is so drunk with power. It is so convinced of its own impunity and that it will never be held accountable for anything it does, that peace with this entity is impossible because this entity cannot bring itself to make peace with the people who it views as inferior and subordinate, and ultimately as people who have neither legitimate rights and certainly no legitimate grievances.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with you. Yeah, sorry, Shamim.
No, go ahead, Hanan.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's this barbaric, inhumane genocide in Gaza, and it's sort of it's impossible to deal with people who are so cruel and evil and racist and so on. It's just, I think the mask has gone too far. There's no way we can even try to attempt to live with this Zionist ideology and this racist sort of, and it's not even the leadership, it's the majority of the Israelis.
Sure. My question was really related to, you were talking about the fact that Israel has this amazing impunity. They just feel they're drunk with power. Nobody can stop them. Having said that, there's sort of this, Palestine has become kind of this moral compass, I think unexpectedly for many people, many Zionists, definitely, where people just feel the injustice to their core and are now taking to the streets. But at the same time, it feels like very little is changing at a government level. So what advice or guidance do you give to activists who advocate for Palestinian rights in this very challenging political landscape?
Well, I think Europe is a very good case in point. Recently, the British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, came up with this entire charade of suspending free trade talks with Israel in response to the intensification of its genocide, while of course continuing with the supply of weapons, intelligence overflights of Gaza, and so on. But I think we have to recognize that this, as insignificant as this is, it does represent a change, and this change would never have happened were it not for public pressure. And I think the British government is now in a wait and see mode. Will the opposition die down or will it intensify? And I think, you know, um, unresponsive governments can be made responsive when the costs of their policies are shown to significantly exceed their benefits. The British Labour Party lost a number of safe seats in the last elections precisely because of Gaza. Um, Kamala Harris in the US lost in part, arguably in significant part, because of Gaza. And now in Europe, you have the European Union launching a review of its association agreement with Israel, this agreement that gives Israel these absurd preferential trade privileges. Here again, this is not something Europe ever wanted to do, but it has been forced to do so under the pressure of public opinion in multiple member states. And the irony is that it's one of the most far right governments in Europe, the government of the Netherlands, that formally initiated this process. Arguably, the de facto leader of the Dutch government, Geert Wilders, is too moderate, would find even the Likud too moderate.
Wow. Yeah.
But so that shows you the impact of public opinion and what more can yet be achieved. The other element, of course, is, as you mentioned, Israel being so drunk with power and assured of its own impunity that they're now openly making one genocidal statement after the other, which is increasingly cornering their supporters in Brussels and Europe's halls of power. So, um, you know, these two trajectories together, I think, do offer opportunities.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Maureen, also we'll be adding, of course, links to your work and so on. But are there any current projects or campaigns related to Palestine that the audience should follow or support? And also, is there a message that you'd like to leave with our viewers and listeners today in terms of standing in solidarity with Palestine?
Well, I think my main message is get as informed as you can, because ultimately the best defense and the best offense is facts and correct interpretation rather than simply being right. Being right is not enough. Being morally correct is important, but not enough. You have to have the information available and to be able to deploy it, and it's available in multiple locations. It's now 2025. You don't have to actually spend an afternoon or a full day in a library to look these things up. They're available literally at your fingertips.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a really hopeful way to leave things, Moin, if because it does make a difference. Basically, what you're saying is that we can all educate ourselves, we can all make a difference by pressuring our governments in one way or another. And pressuring it economically. So as we wrap up, thank you for joining us today, Mouin. As Martin Luther King said, quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." It's our collective responsibility to speak out against injustice and suppression. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please like it, share it, even with one person, and subscribe. Your engagement helps us to amplify voices that are grounded in humanism, truth, and justice. Enlightenment Podcast, we hope, is enlightenment activism. Maureen, thank you for joining us today, for your clarity, your insight, and your enduring commitment to Palestine.
And just to add, stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, and most importantly, take action. Our collective power is the way forward. In solidarity, see you next time. And Mouin, thank you for all that you do for Palestine. Shukran.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed our discussion.